Well, good afternoon, everyone. Happy holidays. I guess today is solstice, so we'll single that one out for the moment. And it's nice to see that either you've all got your holiday shopping taken care of and all of the jobs done or whatever. Anyway, welcome to everybody. Glad you're here this afternoon. And I hope that you'll find the session to be interesting and worth your afternoon's 2 hours. Let's talk a little bit about how we need to communicate. We're talking about ethics here, which means bidirectional discussion is a kind of a fun thing to be able to do. The ad for the course is pretty precise because we're going to talk about some ethical dilemma type situations, not exactly how hard do you get your hand slapped if you're caught doing something wrong, because I think most of us have already taken that course once or twice or maybe more. So hopefully we've got something new. And I thought I had my throat cleared. Let's see what we can do. So in order to do discussion, the easiest way to do that is to do Q&A. So if you have a question or if I ask a question, then you can just type it in the Q&A. If you have any technical difficulties, please type those in the chat box and the host will take care of technical issues. I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me, and I am now looking at my participant box, and I would ask if anyone can't hear me, please raise your hand. All right, and of course I was kidding when I said that, but I love that expression. If you can hear me, then please raise your hand. Let's just make sure we got the hand raise thing going okay. And if as soon as I see 50%, okay, there's good 50%. That's good enough. That means everybody ought to, and everybody's really getting good at this raise the hand stuff. If there's any one good thing that may have come out of the pandemic, it was everybody learning how to really navigate through Zoom. So anyway, okay, wonderful. Glad we're all communicating. I'm sure I'll be able to hear you. If by any chance I miss you typing into the Q&A box, feel free to unmute and call that to my attention. But for the most part, since we have 40 participants now, that gets a little bit out of hand if everybody has microphones on and trying to talk. But on the other hand, Q&A is quite manageable. Okay, so ethics in the engineer, food for thought. What's that all about? Well, let's take a look. There have been a number of ethical problems that have made the headlines starting in 1903 about the so-called NRA, which was non-existent. Maybe that N stands for non-existent. But the ones that do not have asterisk after, they can be found in this particular reference. I'm going to show you a picture of that in the next slide. And but the ones that have asterisks, they come from other places. And when we get to those, the references will appear in case you want to follow up on any of these. Some of the follow-ups are pretty interesting. I followed up on a couple last night, for example, Fukushima. And when we get there, we'll talk about that. But thanks to the internet, even if something here is only from 2020, one can easily say, okay, what's the situation in 2022? So I decided we'll just say that the idea has been placed, and if there might be an update, it's pretty straightforward to get updates on the internet. So you may be familiar with some of these. Space Shuttle Columbia, for example, and then of course the Space Shuttle Challenger. I remember walking across the university campus looking north about 150 miles south of that, and then watching that thing blow apart, and that was really quite a disturbing feeling as I was walking along. And others of you maybe remember that same thing. And of course, then there's the Chernobyl accident and the 3 Mile Island, and just lots of things out there that were Exxon Valdez, for example. It got a lot of press. The Denver Airport runway concrete, probably not much was said about that, and that's all I'm going to say about it now. It's just one of those issues that got some attention way back when. Okay. Here's Flederman's book. This happens to be the 4th edition. And this is I taught a course out of this for engineering ethics, since it's now required in engineering programs. And I found it to be pretty interesting and pretty useful. So anyone wants to pursue any of the topics or just read up on what's being taught to students these days, find a copy of this book and look through it. It's kind of interesting and it's very useful. So what about ethics? Well, let's start. You obviously go talk about something, you ought to look at the definition. So here's one. The discipline dealing with what's good or bad or right or wrong, and with moral duty and obligation. And for the Greeks, it was not distinguished from the sphere of aesthetics. All right, that's interesting. Group of moral principles, not quite what we're talking about for engineers. Good or bad, yeah, okay. The principles of conduct governing an individual or a profession, standards of behavior, okay. I guess most professions have got codes of ethics. We're going to be looking at the civil engineering code of ethics today, just as a basis of discussion, because if you look at any of the other discipline codes of ethics, whether it's IEEE or ASME or whichever, they all pretty much say the same thing. And we're going to be taking a look at what they say, and whether or not one could argue is what they say what they mean, or what do they mean by what they say. And there's some interesting dilemmas that just because we try to write down what it is. Now here, being in accord with approved standards of behavior or a socially or professionally accepted code. Well, here we go. Well, all of our disciplines have got their own codes of ethics. So therefore, it's real easy for us. We just read the code of ethics and behave according to it, and nothing will ever go funny, sort of. So that's what we're going to look at is if we have all these codes of ethics written down, what's the problem, or what's the issue, or what might be? So how do you develop a code of ethics? Well, you start by defining and accepting certain fundamental principles. And like this, create safe, resilient, and sustainable infrastructure. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Treat all persons with respect, dignity, and fairness in a manner that fosters equitable participation without regard to personal identity. Another good idea. You know what? I'm guessing that everybody in this audience can read, so I'm just going to click, because that way we save a little bit more time for discussion. Okay, now I see there's 4 things up in chat. I'm going to take a quick look, because normally, oh, where can you verify that you're muted? Take a look to see whether if there's a microphone next to your name in the participant box. There should be a line through the microphone. Okay. But yeah, there you go. The host took care of that one. So good. We're all set with those, the chats. Okay. So let's just take a look at the kinds of things that people have pretty much agreed upon, the leadership of the various professional societies. And kind of hard to argue that any of these are not good ideas. And once you get all these good ideas down, then you have to put it in the form of a code. So how do you do that? Well, here's how ASCE did it, and published their most recent version on the 26th of October in 2020. They start out by defining who are the stakeholders and what is a priority for making them happy. All right. I mean, if you had a choice of making the person sitting next to you in the office happy versus somebody in government or one of your clients or whatever, who do you choose? So First priority, according to ASCE, is society, or at least, yeah, in the following order of priorities. So society. So we first have to make sure that we apply our ethical principles to society as a whole. And then there's the natural and built environment. So this is an important thing that essentially all of the societies are mentioning now as the natural environment. I think people are kind of catching on to global climate change. The profession itself, clients and employers, that's kind of far down the list, one would think. But then again, if your client or employer wants you to do something that would not be beneficial for society, well, here's a code that says you have some justification for saying, do you think this is a good idea? Because I think this might be a bad thing for society. And of course, if you say that, then you're looking for another job, maybe, who knows? We're going to talk about those kinds of things. And your peers are at the bottom of the list. Now, previously to this, the ASCE code had 8 canons that basically, and a canon is basically an observation, and that pretty much include those priorities. But for 2020 and 2022 in particular, I felt that it was important that we recognize the priorities that the civils have established for their own code of ethics. And I think we could probably look through any of the other codes and find that this is pretty much the same for the EEs and the MEs and so forth. Okay, now, once you get into ethics, then you start talking about ethical theories. So let's just look at a couple of them. For example, utilitarianism. And I'm going to repeat these again because there will be a couple of quiz questions based on the various ethical theories. And utilitarianism is simply the idea that actions are good that serve to maximize human well-being. All right. And you notice I boldface human, not necessarily well-being of the planet or animals or water or mountaintops or anything like that, human. This goes back to when people weren't so much worried about these things. So, example of utilitarianism is finding a place to store nuclear waste or using eminent domain to build a freeway. Where do you build these things? And it's oftentimes we build all these kinds of things, waste disposal dumps, where people who are underprivileged just happen to be living. And there's some interesting ethical implications there. And you may have noticed at the beginning here, there's a second author on this, Jane Caputi. Jane happens to be my significant other who teaches in the humanities. And she talks about how the underprivileged seem to be the ones who get all of the waste and the garbage from those who are more privileged. And there's a certain issue there that utilitarianism would maybe clash with. Okay, so in any case, then there's the cost benefit analysis. We love that. We always like to do cost benefit analysis. Insurance companies love it, utilities love it, automobile makers love it. How much is it going to cost versus how much payout might we be looking at if somebody sues us? So in any case, determine costs and benefits and maximize the ratio, which is kind of like utilitarianism. But the benefits sometimes are difficult to quantify. Such the benefit might be cleaner air from a hybrid or an electric vehicle. So cost benefit analysis, sometimes things that are kind of hard to price out, but maybe there is a benefit to society as a result of taking certain action in relation to these things that could benefit. Duty and rights ethics. Well, this one is really a tough one. Actions are good that respect the rights of the individual, and duty ethics implies all people have the duty to protect the rights of others, and that sounds nice. And rights ethics implies people have fundamental rights that others have the duty to protect. Now, there's where the discussion comes in. What are these ethics, and what are these rights, and so forth? And then virtue ethics, that's simply based on the idea that actions are right if they support good character, and they're wrong if they support bad character. So my goodness, all we have to do is define good and bad, and we're good to go here on this one. So in any case, they're based on individual behavior. All right, so 4 different ethical theories. There's some more, but these in particular are interesting. And we're going to kind of look at some situations and see how these various ethical theories apply to the situations. We're going to start on the northwest corner of Great Slave Lake up in the Canadian Northwest Territories. I'm sorry, not Great Slave Lake, Great Bear Lake. Great Slave Lake's around 500 miles south of Great Bear. And this is the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the village of Delaunay. And what that means is they're basically self-governing, even though they're within the Canadian governed area. And they're pretty much in partnership with the Canadian government, but they pretty much are also autonomous. And it's an interesting place. And from time to time, we're going to reflect back to them, because there's more than one code of ethics that applies to people. Like, well, maybe we're talking about ethical codes of ethics for engineers, but I've heard that even attorneys have codes of ethics. Haven't seen them, but it's highly likely to do. But here's a society that has a code of ethics, and take a look at these. Look how straightforward. Share what you have, help each other, love each other. Not infinitely, but do the best you can do as much as possible. Pretty practical. And sleep at night, work during the day. Somebody must have been thinking about circadian rhythms there. And be polite, don't argue. And young girls and boys should behave respectfully and pass on the teaching and be happy. How can you improve on that? So at least this certainly works well for this community of around 400 or 500 folks living up there. And that truck there, for example, got there by driving across the frozen lake in the wintertime. But then there's the 10 Commandments, and the Golden Rule, and a whole lot of others, such as the IEEE and all the engineering codes of ethics. So there's lots of codes of ethics out there. Let's talk a little bit about sustainability and environmental ethics, because environmental ethics is becoming kind of important, and a lot of these older theories haven't mentioned the environment. So, for example, in Delaunay, you're looking at the airport terminal there on top, and you're looking at one of the elders of the community cleaning a lake trout. Now, it's kind of interesting because there are lake trout in the Great Lakes, along Lake Superior in particular. And I understand now from some of my relatives back in Minnesota that you can drive along the North Shore of Lake Superior, stop at a restaurant and get a lake's trout dinner, but it's pretty hard to find lake trout in any grocery stores. And similarly, if you go to the one restaurant in Delaunay and hope to order lake trout, it's not on the menu. And so in terms of sustainability, if anybody comes in by flight and stays in their 8-unit hotel, they eat food that's imported as well. And the only way you eat the food of the folks who live there is if you get invited to visit with the folks who live there. And then you might get a fantastic dinner of lake trout. But sustainability, in other words, the folks here, it's a lot like the concept of a zero energy building, that the amount exported equals the amount imported, so that you got zero net. And that means a lot of this stuff doesn't get exported, and it's just used as needed by the locals. So if we look at canon number 1 of ASCE, strive to comply with the principles of sustainable development. That kind of fits right in with environmental ethics. So then we ask ourselves whether exponential growth is sustainable. All right, and what about global climate change? What's going to happen there? Transportation is what we have now. Is that sustainable for the next 400 years? Energy is what we have now in terms of fossil fuel mix and so forth. Is that sustainable for another 400 years? Construction with a lot of concrete, fairly energy intensive. Is that sustainable? Can we keep on doing that? So in other words, engineers and architects do have certain issues that they should be looking at according to the sustainability requirement in ASCE Canon 1. Now, maybe you can find another discipline that doesn't have this as one of their environmental or as one of their ethical principles, and then maybe it's okay to do all that bad stuff. But then again, who's to decide what's good or bad? So that's another interesting issue. Water, a while back, not too long ago, Cape Town, South Africa, just about ran out of water. Mining ethics, we're going to talk a little bit about mining gold a little later on, and a little ethics involved with that. And if something is sustainable, does that automatically give it an ethical label? And well, it's something to think about. So let's look at some details here. Canon 1 says engineering deals with structures, machines, products, devices that may affect life, safety, health, and welfare of the general public. Okay, we know that. And that's why if a engineering student says, I got a D in this course and I'm going to flunk out, can you please change my grade? We say, well, guess what? You may well be handling with products and devices that may affect the life, safety, and health and welfare of the general public. And that's why we have a grading scale to give us a better indication as to whether you're going to do this responsibly or something like that. So that gets into some very interesting ethics, even at the level of engineering education. Only approve or seal documents personally reviewed or prepared in accordance with accepted codes and standards. Well, we've all heard that one before, but it also happens to be a part of Canon 1. Inform employers or clients of possible consequences if their judgment on issues relating health, safety, or welfare are overruled. And here comes the all kinds of things where the employees have been overruled for whatever reason, whether it's a challenger accident or whatever. And we've heard of a lot of those situations, but it's still, that's our job, whether or not the people who hear what we tell them are happy about hearing that. Of course, our job is to be factual in the presentation of whatever we send to them. And if it's not factual, but if it's highly likely that, at least we need to show what the possibilities and probabilities might be. So that's another one that's interesting to know exactly what that entails in terms of informing. Report apparent violations of Canon 1, do it in writing to the right people. Can participate in constructive public service activity. Okay, and adhere to principles of sustainable development to enhance quality of life for general public. So now the question is, which ethical theory applies here to that would say you have to adhere to the principles of sustainability? All right. So here, let's take a look at these ethical theories again. Oh, there's 2 Q&As. I'm sorry. Let's see what we got. The canons may appear. The question is, where do these ASCE canons of ethics appear? I'm looking at the ASCE Code of Ethics. These canons appeared in the previous edition of the ASCE Code. I don't think they are in there in the exact wording at this point. I think the 2020 revision took the canons away. As I had pointed out earlier, that the canons are a lot like what are perhaps better categorized in the 2020 version. Let's see. Oh, okay. And here, and oh, okay. There's the reference. And it is likely that you don't see it, but if you look up ASCE Code of Ethics for of 2018 or 2016, it's reasonably likely you'll find them there. And let's see, what else have we got? Answer live, answer live, answer live. What else do we have down here? Right. Okay. Okay. Got it. And thank you for asking the question. Yeah, it's convenient. The outline of the canons, the 8 canons, gives an interesting outline for discussion. And the canons are ever so slightly different from the way the code is currently written. But we're laying this thing out as just a background so that we can discuss certain real life situations that require engineering and architectural judgment that have ethical implications. So, okay. So which of, let's go back that one slide if I can do that. Let's see. Am I able to do that? Nope, can't do that. Let's go previous. And let's go previous again. And whoops, what have I done? Oh, no, I got confused of where it was. We were asking which of the utilitarianism, or which of the ethical theories fit the sustainability and canon number 1. And we're not going to look for an answer here, but just these are here for you to think about. What we could do, though, let's just, for a purpose of discussion, how many of you would feel that utilitarianism would be related to sustainability, and that utilitarianism would imply that it's necessary to do sustainable things? And just raise your hand if it in your mind. And again, these are things, this is what you think. It's not important what somebody else thinks, it's how you feel about it, because that's part of what's interesting about this whole ethical thing, is that not necessarily everybody agrees on everything. Okay, so we've got a reasonable group of folks who feel like utilitarianism is something that implies that we need to look at sustainability. Okay. How about cost benefit analysis? Does that maybe have anything to do with sustainability? And so let's do another hand raised thing about whether you think, and see, sustainability could incorporate all 4 of these, 3 of these, 2 of these, 1 of these, or none of these. So we're just trying to get a feeling for how many of these might be applicable. All right, so we got a reasonable group of folks who feel like cost benefit of analysis implies paying attention to sustainability. I suppose one might argue that if you look at what's happening with property insurance values now after the hurricanes and things that have been going on, and include that in your cost benefit analysis, then maybe sustainability is pretty clearly cost benefit analysis if you consider it that way. That if it's sustainable, then your insurance is less expensive. And maybe if you look at all the costs involved and you minimize all the costs, maybe that makes sense. I don't know why my phone's making all that noise, but it quit. But I need that to tell what time it is. So duty and rights ethics, how many feel like duty and rights ethics might also have some applicability to sustainability? And a fair number of folks as well. So I said, oh, that's right, the people who raise their hand, their names go to the top. It's not that just the people at the top are raising their hand. It's as soon as you raise your hand, your name moves in the list of participants. Okay, and what about virtue ethics as defined here? Does that apply to sustainability. Okay, and so in other words, here we have these 8 canons, and what we're going to be looking at is how do these 8 canons relate to these various ethical theories, and how important might that be? Okay, so here's another Q&A. Let's see what we've got here. In context of Canon 1, item D, who would be the proper authority? You know what? Let's hang on with that one, because when we get to talking about the Fukushima accident, there's some interesting interpretations of that. Okay, so proper authority, that's a really good question, because it's not necessarily well defined, although there may be some companies who define what the line of responsibility is. You talk to your manager, and then this person and this person, you know, so and so won't listen, then here's what you do, and so forth. But that's a really good question. We're going to focus on that a little more in detail a little bit later. Those little delays are when I cross out that the question's been discussed, so it doesn't give me a list of 45 questions and answers, and I can't find the new ones. Okay, and I'm assuming that the 5 chats are are administrative issues, and I'm not going to be looking at chats. I'll be watching the Q's and A's, so any discussion about the content of the course we'll do through Q&A, and administrative issues, chat box. Okay, so here we go, and we have some idea. Now here's another one: hold safety paramount. Well, that's nice, but now we have to decide what is safe and what isn't, and how safe is safe enough. Okay, and is it possible something to be completely safe? And here we talk about things like human-driven cars versus self-driving cars, air travel and rail travel, chemical plants, power plants, cell phones. And I'm hearing the people working on a neighboring unit, their jackhammer is on. I'm hoping that is not coming through as strongly as it might. I think the Zoom folks has put in some noise filters these days, because it's not terribly loud for me. I'm hoping it's not annoying to anybody in the group. Let's just take a quick, can anybody hear the jackhammers, and do you find it annoying? I'm going to take a look for raising hands. If you find that you can hear the jackhammers, and if they are making it more difficult to understand what I'm saying. All right, and I just have no control over that. I can't run up there and pull a plug on their jackhammer. They just happen to be doing that. So I apologize, Michael, and we're just going to have to hope that they stop. They weren't doing the jackhammer when we started. Hopefully they'll quit soon. But these are the interesting paradoxes you come up with, is can anything be completely safe when safety is held paramount? We do a pretty good job with transportation. Chemical plants, maybe not quite so good. There's been Bhopal and a few accidents like that. Power plants, cell phones, nuclear plants. What about these cell phones? Do they really cause brain cancer? Or is there any research to, you know, a lot of people are afraid of their cell phones, because they certain people are saying you can, all that radiation from them can be harmful, and so they hold them far away from themselves when they talk on them. Whether that's necessary or not, another question. Who knows? But again, it's looking at something that's written down in words and trying to figure out what does it really mean. And that's the interesting part of ethics, is trying to figure out what do these things really mean. Let's look at a question here. Oh, no, cannot hear it. Oh, okay, that makes me feel a whole lot better. Okay. And actually, I can't hear them now either, so I guess they maybe quit for a while. I think they're maybe replacing a floor or something like that. So they're chipping off old tiles and putting on new ones. Anyway, what else might we be wondering about? How do we determine acceptable safety limits? Who does that? And what are the premises of risk analysis? And we're going to talk a little bit about Fukushima. And the Chevrolet ignition switch, some of you may have heard of that, where you'd be driving across an intersection and all of a sudden your engine turned off because of a faulty ignition switch. And how many of those have to happen before Chevrolet gets really serious about a recall? Or whether it's any other, there are a number of other, Ford and almost every auto manufacturer has had one particular model or one particular part that's been a problem over the years, and they've got to deal with it. So let's take a look at Fukushima, okay? And if you want some interesting reading, this happens to be a story put together, and it's a story, but it's based on some pretty significant research that the Union of Concerned Scientists has done. One might argue that they're biased against nuclear power, but if you go to the internet, and I did that just this morning to see what the update is on Fukushima, but let's take a look at a little more background here, and then we'll talk about what's going on now, because we're talking about some things that happened with Fukushima, and which is page 46 we're looking at. And one of the things happened was the reactor owners falsified reports, and regulators failed to scrutinize safety claims. So, what are the ethical implications here? Nuclear boosters dominated safety panels. Gee whiz, nuclear is great, so therefore it's safe. And sometimes we probably all had this situation one way or another within our own profession, and within our own practice for that matter, that one way or another, somehow rules sometimes are buried in just endless committee reviews before they're finally adopted. And what happens when your independent experts were actually paid for by the industry that brought them in? Does that color their report at all? And some of you may have had experience like that. I know I've had some personal experiences where I told it like it is, and I never worked for those people again. Somehow or other, they decided they were going to call somebody else. So these are things that happen, and it certainly happened in Fukushima, well documented. Public meetings padded with industry shills posing as ordinary citizens, cheering for whatever, and trying to take over the meeting so that if anybody has any doubts about this thing, they're crazy and we're sane. Nothing like political donations being made to the members of the Nuclear Safety Commission. I mean, wow. Okay, so here's some of the ethical issues that were involved in this disaster. And here's a specific example. Here's this gentleman, Mr. Sugaoka, who happened to be working for General Electric at Fukushima. And he noticed a crack in the reactor, and he went to Tokyo Electric Power, and they told him to cover up the evidence. And that did not make him a happy person. So he eventually notified the government regulators of the problem, but they passed it back to TEPCO, and guess what? Sugaoka was fired. 2 years later, TEPCO admitted that it had been falsifying safety records for years. So the risks of trying to be ethical. I mean, you know, I personally, if I worked for a company like that, I'd quit, and you know, right away. But a lot of people, maybe it's a time when finding another job as an engineer is not easy. It's a really very complicated situation here that he put himself in, but he followed the rules. He went to his next level of supervision, and he kept going up the line, and he kept getting beaten down. So sort of as an answer to the previous question about who do you talk to, every company has a slightly different hierarchy, and you may or may not succeed in going up that hierarchy. I think almost everybody has heard the story about the Challenger disaster and how the engineers at the manufacturer of the rocket realized that when it was cold outside, those O-rings would be brittle and it would not be safe to launch that spacecraft. And yet it was launched because there was an important, that was the day of the President's State of the Union address. And they wanted him to be able to talk about what a successful launch they had and why NASA needed lots of money to continue their research. Well, it kind of backfired on them, and literally so. And gee whiz. So this is instance here you're looking at on your screen is not the one and only instance of somebody reporting up the line and getting, let's say this is, maybe you could argue this is good results because maybe this wasn't a good job anyway. But this is one of the things that can happen and has happened. If we look at recent reports, here's some URLs to look at. Because the International Atomic Energy Agency requires periodic reports on how the cleanup is doing over there. And so that's one reference. And as of February 11, 2016, this is after 4 years, the estimate was the decommissioning of the plant is expected to take up to about 40 years. And but at that time it was stable. It's got a big challenge taking out the molten nuclear fuel debris. At that time, the state of the debris was still unknown, and 750,000 tons of contaminated water had been stored in 1,000 tanks. I was a little curious this morning, and I looked up, and the guess on 40 years seemed to be about right, and it is still in 2022. The case that the state of the debris, the molten nuclear fuel debris, is still unknown. They haven't been able to get close enough to get any information on that. So they're still estimating somewhere in the neighborhood 40-year cleanup on that. And they now have a plan for cleaning up and discharging these 750,000 tons of contaminated water by dilution and other things. But again, I'll invite you to look at the IAEA reports, and but you don't just need to look at them. You can just Google current state of Fukushima cleanup activity, and you'll get all kinds of references. So again, this was quite a disaster. Probably this and Chernobyl are probably the two most serious accidents that have happened. As of 2015, 100,000 couldn't go home, and there's lots of contaminated soil. So this is quite a disaster. Why did it happen? Well, for one thing, the design was based on earthquake, and the thing was pretty solid. These reactors were built pretty well, and they pretty well withstood an earthquake, but nobody thought about the idea that if that earthquake happens under the ocean, it might cause a big tsunami. And it's the tsunami resulting from the earthquake that did all the damage. The buildings were intact, but the water from the earth, from the tsunami, washed right on through. And they had done some cutting down of some hills at the coast to make the view a little nicer. which made it easier for the tsunami to get in. So that was done independently of the plant. So interesting stuff. And it's amazing to read about the way from about 1995 or so on out, the way folks stumbled and covered up and so forth until finally this accident came out. So let's move on to Canon 2. And this is on qualification. Qualified engineer by education or experience, and it's okay to be about a problem of, it's okay to be a part of a project team, and each player has a different position on this team. I'm sure everybody's aware of that. We've got some folks who are better at electrical, and we've got others who are better at wind load calculation in our group. And so we talk to each other a lot as a team to make sure that we get the overall project right. Only seal documents that lie within the established expertise that has been prepared personally under your supervision. And this can, well, let's look at this. These are the black things. These are the definitely this is what you have to do. But these are some of the interesting questions that still remain after we define these Canon 2 details. What does competence really mean? I mean, I'm not sure that I still know. I think that what's really important is that you need to know what you know, and you need to know what you don't know. And sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and that gets dangerous. But if you know what you don't know, that's a good step, because those who know everything probably don't know anything. Hard to tell. And you need to be careful of anybody who appears to know everything, because where do you draw the line? Anyway, so this is one of those challenging questions from an ethics standpoint, is what does it really mean to be competent? And how do we establish it? And who judges it that it's achieved? And what's the responsibility of the individual? If somebody says, oh, you must know about this, and you know for sure you don't know about it, how do you answer that question? So on the left, some pretty straightforward things, pretty obvious. This is all you have to do. But then, oh my goodness, there's some other issues that make these black things on the left a little more complicated than the blue things that we notice on the right. So these are the kind of dilemmas that we'll be talking about as we move through the 8 canon of the previous code. And as maybe this will explain why I wanted to hang on to these 8 canons, because it's almost like an outline for discussing the complexities of meeting all of the ethical requirements. And a lot of these, you probably have your own answers, and we may not all have the same answers to all these questions, but that is our job as individuals to make these kinds of decisions. And sometimes it's not easy. Let's look at Canon 3. Be honest with the public. Include all the relevant information. Testify only on the facts. Identify revenue sources if somebody else is paying you to make statements. And make sure that the profession is above all, including your self-interest. All right, again, that's canons. That's what the code says. So that's easy. You just do all this stuff and you're fine. Well, except outside pressure can complicate these things. I know we're going to talk about a water heater test report that was an experience of mine about 30 years ago. And but then I wonder if there's anybody on this group who hasn't experienced either client pressure or a client might be the government, and outside pressure complicating what you believe to be ethical judgment. And I'm not going to ask for hand raise on this thing. Well, maybe I am. Yeah, let's see how many of you may have feel some pressure to do something that you just don't think is the right thing to do. So Yeah, okay, it's almost everybody. So the point is, so now what do you do? When you're really caught between a rock and a hard place, and yet we have this well-defined code of ethics that we have to follow. And so that's my whole point here, that these well-defined codes of ethics, that's why they try to keep renewing them. That's why they keep trying to renew building codes and electric codes and stuff, because new information becomes available, and so you change things. What about spinning a statement? My goodness, nobody would do a thing like that, would they? Certainly not in engineering or architecture, but I mean, we're used to politicians doing that, but how, why would an engineer? Well, again, outside pressure, sometimes if your job is on the line, you got a tough decision to make. And maybe the first thing to ask is whether anybody else is hiring. I don't know. This is a situation I encountered, oh, I was probably almost 40 years ago now. I'd been doing some work in energy conservation after the OPEC oil embargo in the mid 1970s. And somebody had decided that putting a timer on a water heater is a way to save energy, and of course to save money. So they hired this engineering testing firm, name of which to be remain undisclosed. And they said, here's the setup we'd like you to use. Of course, we have to be totally fair. So we're going to have two identical water heaters. We're going to use identical amounts of water. We've got the exact same water supply to both of the water heaters, so that the same kind of water, same temperature delivered to each of these water heaters. The one on the left is going to have a timer, and the one on the right is not going to have a timer. We're going to draw a certain amount of hot water from these, or a certain amount of water from these, assuming it's going to be hot. And we're going to see whether the one with the timer saves 30%, because that was the claim. And this testing outfit was asked that to please prove that you can save 30% by putting a timer on a water heater. And this is electric water heater that heats on demand. So you put a timer, and then it can't heat at certain times. Well, okay, what happened? Whoops, I've got to go backwards here. This tell you the story. So hold on, where's my cursor? There it is. So here's what happened. The company did the test, same amount of water in each pail, same inlet water, and so on. And sure enough, the tank with the thermostat set to 120 degrees used 30% less energy than the tank with the thermostat set to 140 degrees. And of course, the inlet water was 70 degrees. So going up 50 degrees instead of going up 70 degrees saved 30%, because they used the same amount of water. But that's how they proved that the timer saved 30%. When fact of the matter is, modern water heaters are insulated sufficiently well that the only time it makes sense to have a timer is if you have a solar water heater. Then you may want to hold off and not turn on any utility backup electricity until after the sun goes down. And then if it didn't do a good enough job of making enough hot water, maybe you'll heat it up. But otherwise, this was a test, and it actually, how did I know about this? One was at 120, one was at 140. It was on about page 6 in fine print on the report, after they'd already said there was a 30% reduction in energy consumption. So that was maybe one of my very first exposures to unethical behavior on the part of an engineering group who had undoubtedly been pressured by their client, and maybe a good client, who might have dropped them as a client or as an engineering firm if they hadn't come up with the right answer. So forget about the ethics. You know, you got to please your customer. Well, sort of. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that these are the kinds of interesting ethical decisions that face us all the time, regardless of whether we got codes of ethics or not. Elizabeth Holmes got a little more notoriety just recently. She founded Theranos in 2003, and in 2015, it was revealed it had misrepresented its blood testing technology. Securities and Exchange Commission charged her with fraud, stripped her of controlling stake in the company, fined her $500,000, and barred her from being an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. Well, she seems to be around again and getting some notoriety. So again, if you want to follow up and if you want to read this story, here's the story, the URL for the story. But if you want to follow up what's going on, Google Elizabeth Holmes 2022 and see what she's up to today. But again, ethical issue, made the newspapers, not a good thing. Punishment, big time, $500,000. And presumably people learn from things like this. So I invite you to Google and find out, in fact, what was learned. We go back now to Delaunay, Northwest Territories, kind of pretty country up there. This is the Bear River. It runs north out of the northwest corner of the lake. And this, the distinction here is that in the southeast corner of this big lake is a fairly substantial, or was a fairly substantial, deposit of uranium oil. And back in the days of the Manhattan Project, they had to get uranium from somewhere, and guess what? This is where it came from. And even though it was kind of known that working in a radioactive environment is probably not a good deal, after the mining that took place, people, the husbands, the men who worked in the mines, started dropping dead, getting cancer, whatever. And this village, and this is not Delaunay, because this village is probably 30 miles or so. Delaunay is on the northwest corner of Great Bear Lake, Great Bear, and the village that the mining took place was the opposite corner of the lake. I say opposite corner when the lake is kind of round, but it's also kind of oval or rectangular shape. So here's an interesting question. You know, did the company who employed these miners up here to do the mining, were they aware of the dangers? And so on goes the question about that. And so let's look at a little more details here. In order to get it out, there's very few roads up in this country. You either drive in across the water when it's frozen, or else you move by water to get that uranium out of there. And the uranium was shipped out, and it went along this river, which is near Delaunay, because this is the outlet to the lake up in the northwest corner. Okay, and so they had to ship it across the lake and down the river. And these were all indigenous people who were working at the mines. So, you know, the way folks treated them, ethics and origins. Anyway, a lot of them died of cancer. And the thing that makes me almost come to tears every time that I think about this is the fact that survivors made a pilgrimage to Japan in about the year 2000 to apologize. If you can imagine that. And this is at Village of Widows, and where there's still of the Dene people with the Dene Code of Ethics that we looked at earlier. And if this isn't an incredible example of saying, we are really sorry, we had no idea. They just had to do that. And so they went to Japan to apologize. So it's an amazingly heartwarming story. Not everybody's heard about it, but now you have, and you can think about it now, especially during the holiday season. Then there's Yellowknife up in Northwest Territories of Canada, the capital of the Canadian Northwest Territories. beautiful place, government building here. Off to the left is an outdoor fair kind of a thing where vendors and so forth, like in any case, and here's some more pictures of downtown Yellowknife, very modern city. The Yellowknife River, beautiful condos up on a hill looking over the river. Old Yellowknife, where you're in this particular restaurant, spitting was prohibited, for spitting on the floor or the walls for that matter. And but boy, did they ever have good Arctic char at this restaurant. And that lady is the lady who's the co-author, who's been writing about some of this material in her own discipline. And and there she is again, looking at some of the beautiful scenery around. More beautiful scenery, and then here's all that beautiful scenery, and then you see a sign like this that says, "Keep out contaminated area." And you drive down the road a little further and you see another one, "Keep out contaminated area." So what's this all about? So you go downtown Delaney, or not Delaney, downtown Yellowknife, and you start asking questions, and you come across this little shop that tells the Yellowknife story. And the story is that between 1935 and 2004, 7 million ounces of gold were mined from arsenopyrite ores. That's a combination of arsenic and gold and a few other things. So that means the gold had to be separated from the arsenic, and the easiest way to do that was get it really hot. And what that did was it would oxidize the arsenic into arsenic trioxide. And as a result of separating the gold from the arsenic, they had leftovers 237 kilotons of arsenic trioxide, or 8.36 times 10 to the 9th ounces. That's a bunch. Okay, so what do you do with it? Well, first of all, what's arsenic trioxide? Here's a little story about it. Again, if you order the slides at the end, you can read the full story. The bottom line is that it's an oxidation product of arsenic sulfides, and it's really poisonous. And so what they did in the mining process is captured most of the dust. But then what do you do with it once you've captured it? Because there's no thing such as throwing it away. There is no away, as some people are now saying. But at one point, these gases were released to the atmosphere. Okay, and then over the lifetime, there's here's your 237,000 tons. And one thing they found is arsenic trioxide is water soluble, so why not just dissolve it in water? So let's store it in 14 underground chambers underneath Yellowknife. That ought to do the job, except for the fact that there are hundreds of lakes around Yellowknife. And nobody's really quite sure what kind of groundwater situation they have. And nobody's really had the time to go out and measure how much arsenic is in the lakes in the area. But anyway, then folks realize, this may not be the best solution to just keep this water underground. So let's do this. Let's freeze it for the moment. So if you look in the northeast corner of Yellowknife, you'll see a large power plant, a large substation essentially, and this power is powering the refrigeration units underground that's freezing the water underground to keep it from seeping into other bodies. And that's our temporary solution until a better solution comes up. And meanwhile, when they ran out of gold, the mine owners walked away. Something said that they moved to the United States and assumed different names, whatever, who knows. But in any case, they got their money out of the deal. Now it's up to the people in Yellowknife to figure out what to do with the leftover arsenic. So interesting, ethics in mining. Mentioned earlier, here's a nice mining ethics story. I'm sure there's clearly a whole lot more about removing mountaintops, and probably come up with some good stories on fracking and who else knows what. But again, mining is a really complicated thing in terms of ethics. What are we going to do if we don't have all that natural gas, petroleum, or coal? What are we going to do next? I mean, sure, we got solar, it's coming up, but for the moment, what are we going to do to sustain our economies and all? So complicated stuff to try to figure out what's the right thing to do. So in any case, the giant mine has an oversight board, and they're doing research, and they're hoping to come up over the next decade or two or three or four or five or maybe century a solution to deal with all of this arsenic that is said that could probably kill the entire population of the planet several times over. On the other hand, if the semiconductor people need a lot of arsenic, this is a pretty good place to go find some. And of course, it's really traces of arsenic in any kind of semiconductor product. And it's pretty well bound as it's melted in with that silicon. So anyway, a little story about Yellowknife, because not everybody's heard about it, and the ethical implications are incredible. Canon 4. I need to take a quick look at the clock and see how we're doing. It's 3:07. We're a little more than half done. I see 7 chats. I am hoping they're all administrative. Let me remind you again, if you type something in a chat that you wanted to discuss, please redo it in the question and answer, because it would take me about twice as long to be bouncing back and forth between chat and Q&A than just looking at the Q's and A's and trying to come up with good answers. And this is ethics. We do want to discuss, and I'm going to skim over a few things to try to make sure we have some time at the end also for discussion, but I also don't want to necessarily wait to the end. If you see something you want to talk about, please don't hesitate to butt on Q&A, and I try to watch it as closely as I possibly can to make sure I click on that and we talk about whatever you want to talk about. Canon 4, no conflict of interest allowed. And the interesting thing here is a perceived conflict of interest. We're going to expand on that a little bit. And one job involving more than one party pays unless all other payments are disclosed to everybody. Okay. No tips or gifts. Wow. And here we are, holiday season, and you don't dare give somebody a gift card to a $10 gift card to I mean, if they're one of your clients, you don't dare give them a $10 gift card to the local coffee shop. At no tips. I mean, this sounds pretty definite. No tips or gifts, unless, well, let's look at the black print on the other side and see. If you're in government in any capacity, don't hire your own company. Some of you may have had some experience along those lines. Advise employers or clients when it's felt a project will not succeed. That's a tough one too. I don't think this is going to work. I get to do that every once in a while. I get to do that once or twice just last couple of days ago. I don't think if you combine these particular inverters with these particular optimizers with this particular solar modules, I don't think this is going to work. And please tell the client that they probably ought to change their mind and do this differently. So this is pretty common here, and this one is maybe not quite as complicated as some of the other dilemma type stuff. So what might be an unfaithful act in engineering? Gee, can anybody think of something? Has anyone in the group been accused of doing something that was not faithful in terms of the profession? It's okay if you want to type that into, well, let's just look for hands. Let me open my participant box here and see if anybody's had, where have I lost my, that's funny. I don't know if anybody ever loses their cursor by 10. So Mark, if you had a situation, I guess you raised your hand. Anyone else had a situation where you Okay, so there are a few who've been accused of not having the best interest of the company in mind when you felt that you were doing something you needed to do in order to be acting ethically. So, yeah, not necessarily a simple thing to just do it. And what's the limit to loyalty to a company? Everybody, all of us have to come up with some answer within our own mind of how loyal are we willing to be, depending on how anyone else might be trying to bend the rules. And there's always the engineer management and customer relationships that are not necessarily simple. But here's the fun part. What constitutes a tip or a gift? And we're going to take a look at that a little more closely. And where do you draw the line in terms of hiring your own company when you're in government? If you work for, say, a municipal government, and there's, I mean, let's say maybe you happen to be on a town commission that is a part-time job, and your full-time job is as an engineer. And your company is the best company in the entire state for doing a particular job that the municipality wants to be done. Do you bid on it? You know, you're not supposed to do that according to D here. You just don't do it, period. And so anyway, interesting. So let's talk about gifts versus bribes. And this is a test that I really like, and I want to make sure I share it with everybody. You may have heard of it. Before we go any further, let's do another hand raise exercise. How many of you have actually heard about the New York Times test without my explaining what it is yet? All right, we do have 5 people who've heard about it. That's good, or 4. Or were those 5 people who had left their hands up? Anyway, at least we have at least 2 out of 40 who've heard of the New York Times test, and maybe as many as 5. So maybe it's worth talking about it, so that now then 40 out of 40 will have heard about it. 42 out of 42, in fact. So what's the New York Times test? Well, it's pretty straightforward. The New York Times test is simply, let's say you are having lunch with a client, and the client is willing to buy your lunch for you. And would you be willing to have a New York Times reporter sitting at a table right next to you, listening in on your conversation? Okay, because sometimes perception is reality. You might happen to be pretty good friends with a particular vendor, and you may have lunch fairly often, and you may have fairly good purchasing terms with that particular vendor. All right, so golly whiz, how do we determine whether that's a bribe situation? And so what if you go to Five Guys and the sales rep pays for the lunch? Is that a bribe of trying to convince somebody to buy the product? I'm going to leave my participant box open for a little while. How many think lunch at Five Guys where the sales rep is willing to put up the $10 for lunch? Okay, so some feel that could be considered to be a bribe, or maybe let's just say that this would not pass the New York Times test. Okay, so now how many of you think that this maybe would pass the New York Times test? You know, you're sitting there at lunch, you talk about football game, or maybe you talk about the World Cup match or something like that. And you don't, and maybe even talk a little bit about some products about, well, you know, there's we got new what do you call it? No, that you might be interested in seeing, and I can send you data sheets. So would this pass the New York Times test? Is it okay to have that kind of a conversation at a table and not get blasted out of the building? And it looks like a lot of people are okay with that. Okay, and I'm not going to ask how many people have been caught in that situation or not, because we're just doing hypothetical stuff here. Okay, there's a queue up here. I'm going to check on that. Oh, we're talking about $10 a head. Okay, so if that helps you to make your decision, and maybe 12 if you, I don't even know Five Guys. I haven't been there for a while. I forgot whether they have good chocolate milkshakes or not. But anyway, a relatively inexpensive lunch. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I got you, Tom. I guess $10 is pretty cheap. Actually, I went somewhere not too long ago. Maybe it was Hot Dogopolis or something like that, and got lunch for $8 or something, because I only had water for a drink. Yeah. All right. Well, let's say inexpensive lunch. Maybe that's better. All right. So anyway, some people, at least among the group, are saying that maybe it's not so bad to have lunch at Five Guys because it's convenient. It's just 3 blocks away from your office, and it's lunchtime, and you can both benefit by working through the lunch hour so that you have a little more time at home that night or whatever. All right. And then we talk about dinner at the best restaurant in town that's paid by the sales rep. And we got the New York Times reporter there. And the sales rep is, well, who knows, if the sales rep maybe whispers something so the New York Times representative can't hear it, like the coaches do on TV, so that the TV people can't hear what they're saying. This is a little more iffy, isn't it? All right, so somewhere in between Five Guys and the best restaurant in town may be okay in certain environments, but if you're talking about the National Science Foundation, forget it. Rules are very strict there. You can go to lunch with somebody, but you each pay for your own lunch. That's it. But the interesting thing is, even if you pay for your own lunch, if the New York Times is sitting there, Times rep is sitting there, they might start asking questions, or if they can hear what your conversation is, or even if they can't hear your conversation, they might perceive that you're trying to bribe somebody from the National Science Foundation to give you some special consideration on a grant you've applied for, or something like that. So perception is reality. You got to be careful on that. So again, this so-called simple thing, well, okay, no gifts or bribes, period. But then the question is, okay, fine, you both pay for your own meal. Might it still be perceived that there is something underhanded going on? I'm not even going to ask you to answer that, because it's just something to think about. Then there's the Super Bowl tickets paid for by the sales rep after the sale has been completed. Like, hey, thanks, we really appreciate your using our services, and we happen to have these extra tickets. Well, another thing, again, no need to raise the hands, but it's an interesting question. Is this okay? An industry association donating to a particular political candidate? What if some of the members of the association disagree with that? Is that a good idea? Again, something to think about, food for thought. That's partly the title of this presentation, food for thought. And so everybody's supposed to go away after it's over thinking, whoa, wow, that's interesting. Company donating to a political action committee. Like for example, a utility in Florida, perhaps spending $25 million to try to convince the Florida legislature to get rid of net metering for solar energy. Gee whiz, is that okay? It happened. So, is it ethical to do that? Or is it even ethical to use money from, I mean, certainly ratepayer money is one thing, but maybe investor money. Maybe is that okay to use investor money to donate money to politicians? Again, I'm not going to answer, true or false on this. It's just, again, one of those food for thought. Is it okay? How do you feel about that? And you can answer that on your own. Costa Rica's got a lot of wind power, especially a lot of offshore wind, and some fairly competent companies down there that work in that. I had a former student who's fairly active in wind power down in Costa Rica. What if somebody in the States happens to have some knowledge of a particular wind machine, and it would be beneficial to the procurement people and the engineering people and the manufacturing people to all get together for a sit down on what would be the best way to do a particular job? Who pays for the trip? For the United States engineer that's going to represent his company that might be involved in this project. Is there a problem with this? What do the people from the New York Times have to say about that? Again, Ken, 5, we're going to move a little quicker, but it's 3:22, so we have 40 minutes. Political contributions, unconditional. In other words, you can give money, but not money that expects a return on investment. You just give money because you think somebody's the best candidate, but not because you want them to do something that's good for your business. Yours as a single business. Now, maybe you'd like for them, you give them money because it might be good for your profession, and maybe that's okay. Bid on credentials, not on price. Everybody wants to get an engineering company to give them a price for a particular job and forget about whether people in the company are the best qualified for this particular job. But it happens all the time because people don't know that these are rules that we have within, for example, ASCE, that we're supposed to tell them, this is what we're good at, this is what we've done, here's examples. And if this is what you need done, then this would cost roughly this to do the job. Okay, so again, here's the blue stuff, the obvious, but here's the black stuff, the less than obvious. Okay, how do you establish merit? How do you convey your reputation? And this gets especially interesting with the internet, because interesting things can go viral on social media. Oh no, that could never happen, could it? Yeah, we can forget about that one. Unfair competition, what is that? And I'm sure everybody can think of something that's marginal and that would easily be debatable, and easily people could disagree on a particular example. Is it okay to change engineers on a job? If so, when and how? Under what circumstances? Okay. So then we come to things like the March 16th, 2018 Florida International University in Miami collapse of the bridge across a fairly major thoroughfare. I see 8. I'm so curious. I got to see what's up there. Okay. Mike, if you and anyone else, here's something in the, yeah, okay, and PDH said please type in your Q in Q&A. Okay, so PDH is handling that. Thank you, Mr. Host. I appreciate that. Okay, now I don't have to be curious because our host is, in fact, and our host himself is an engineer, so he's very ethical and posting all the questions. So let's look at this bridge collapse. And again, this is now kind of closed out, but this is near and dear to me because I worked at a sister institution, not in 2016 or 2018, but I retired from a sister institution in 2005. And I knew some of the engineers down there, and I knew one of the vice presidents down there came from my university. Anyway, a lot of people are aware of this, that 950 tons of concrete collapsed and killed 6 people that were driving under this bridge not too long after it had been installed. National Transportation Safety Board was investigating. They've completed their investigation. As the time of this, there were no conclusions, but once again, they take their time. They're very thorough, and their final conclusions are now available, and all you need to do is Google them to find out what the conclusion was. And it's really interesting, but as we predicted before the conclusions, it was very obvious that the ABC method, which was the method used for building that bridge and designing that bridge, to be carefully scrutinized, and that certainly was the case. The design activity, including the bidding, would be carefully scrutinized, and it certainly was. Procurement activity, carefully scrutinized. Yes, ma'am, it sure was. Yes, sir, I guess. I don't sure we have too many ma'ams, and I don't think we have any in this group, which is most unusual. Construction. So everybody involved in any phase of it is going to be questioned and scrutinized. The permitting, the inspection, all of this stuff. Lots and lots of hearings, lots of litigation, lots of ethical challenges. And Miami Herald has lots of photos and videos and so forth. If you just use this particular reference, if you want to know more about the Miami Bridge collapse, I'm not even sure. It's possible that our host may even some of the continuing ed providers are actually offering a course on this bridge collapse alone to go into the very deeply into the details of it. To spend entire 2 hours on that bridge collapse. But once again, this is just a matter of, we have these codes of ethics that, of course, everybody follows, and yet we have bridges collapse and buildings collapse and whatever. So where's the disconnect here? Where is the disconnect? Canon 6. Don't knowingly engage in a business that's fraudulent, dishonest, or unethical. Oh, that's easy. Okay, we certainly won't do that. And we'll certainly be scrupulously honest all the time in terms of controlling and spending money. And zero tolerance for bribery, fraud, and corruption. Really, really vigilant when bribery and gratuities are institutionalized, like some countries, presumably. In some areas, whatever, you just can't get a job unless you offer somebody a few dollars on the side, or a few hundred or thousand, depending on the extent of the job. Transparency in project procurement and execution, of course, we all do that. Encourage use of zero tolerance certifications, of course. Oh, except wait a minute, what does knowingly mean? Kind of tricky. And if you discover that somebody knowingly engaged in a business that's fraudulent, dishonest, or unethical, now what are you going to do? Good question. So when you're scrupulously honest in the control and spending of money, you need to know what is needed and what it should cost. Very interesting. Example, condominium, interested in chargers for electric vehicles. What should a level 2 charger cost? How much installed? And so on. And very interesting, certain power companies are now getting involved in a mere so many dollars a month for 10 years for them to install an electric car charger for you. So it's almost as though they're doing it for free, except they're not, because there says nothing in their ad about whether you still have to buy the electricity once they install the charger for almost nothing. So interesting, just an example. Do rules change if gratuities are institutionalized? I mean, I mentioned that some places where you just can't get a job unless somebody's got their hand out. And what if the client doesn't want you to tell how much it costs? Then what? And on a zero tolerance certification, how do you guarantee those? I'm not even sure. Well, I guess a zero tolerance certification meaning here is that you sign a piece of paper that says that we will not tolerate any kind of fraudulent behavior. But how do you guarantee it? That's another story. Canon 7, there's 8 of them. And this means you got to keep current. Well, that's what everybody's doing right now. We're doing continuing ed course. Okay, and everybody, of course, spends their evenings reading technical literature. Nobody ever watches TV unless it's a TV on how to design something or something like that. And of course, attending professional meetings are as good. Encourage employee registration. That seems like the obvious thing to do. What happens if all of your employees are registered? Is that good? Well, we'll look at whatever type appears on the right-hand side of the screen. Certainly encouraging employee professional development. I'm not aware of any company that doesn't do that one way or another. And appropriate job titles. I'm going to have a quiz for you on this one in just a minute. So why do you choose particular courses? Well, maybe it's an interesting topic. Maybe you've always wanted to learn it. Maybe the price is right. Maybe your employer wants you to do it. Okay, so keeping current, your employer might give you a little boost on that as to what they would like to see you do. What might be a drawback of everybody being registered? Well, I mean, I can see a drawback there. I mean, some people, you need somebody to do design and somebody to do drafting and so forth. And there are lower level engineering tasks that people who are not necessarily registered can be fairly good at, as long as their breadth of interest is limited to doing a particular task well. And they may have engineering credentials, they may just not be registered as a professional engineer. So again, just think about whether this is necessarily desirable to have everybody on your payroll be a registered engineer. Now, I guess if you do legal work, it's pretty nice for all the people who are doing the legal work themselves, other than the office work and the bookkeeping and so forth. Certainly, if you're going to testify, it's very good to have those credentials. But is it necessarily the case all the time when, in fact, the previous canon says that you don't sign anything unless it was created under your supervision, which generally means by somebody who's not a PE. So, in other words, there are some interesting things. And can a title ever be a substitute for salary? And I want to take a quick look at that title as a substitute for salary. And this is a personal experience that we had here at our condominium building about 5 years ago. An engineering firm was hired, and a very large national firm. They sent an engineer out who handed out a business card, gave his name, and his title was senior engineer. And right after that senior engineer was comma EI, not PE, but EI. Okay. And that particular engineer who got up on the platform and started tapping away at the stucco to see whether the stucco was intact, had a brand new tool belt, and in any case, I'm kind of curious. I'm going to drop down my participant box again and just ask, how many think it's okay for this guy who does not have a PE to have a title of senior engineer? Please raise your hand if you think it's okay, or maybe we should say if you don't think it's okay. Let's do the other way around. If you don't think it's a good idea for that person to have a title of senior engineer when the person is not even registered as an engineer, then please raise your hand. All right, we got pretty good agreement here that maybe this just isn't the right thing to do, to promote someone who's just learning to the title of senior engineer before they get their PE. And even when they first get their PE, maybe they shouldn't be called a senior engineer, but maybe it's okay now to call them an engineer. I know that in my company, not my company, the company I consult for, they're very fussy about giving anybody title of engineer. Somebody might be engineering supervisor, but that's not necessarily saying that person's an engineer. Trained as an engineer, has bachelor's in engineering, but in any case, it's interesting, and I was very surprised to see a nationally acclaimed company send somebody like that out. But then again, we were small change compared to the big jobs they're used to doing, so I guess we would be a training ground and so on and so forth. But please at least be honest with us about the credentials and the qualifications of the person you're sending out, who incidentally had to make a phone call every time he found something to get, at least he wasn't making the decisions, but he did have to make a phone call and sometimes had to wait to get called back. So maybe we lost a little time on that job. Anyway, just interesting. Let's look at some more Canon 8 details here. And I appreciate your feedback. I generally ask that question every time I do this webinar, and you're very consistent with others. So here we go, last canon. All persons treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. Of course we do that. How could we possibly not do that? Okay, then there's no discrimination or harassment in connection with professional activities. And of course, we endeavor in good faith to include diverse perspectives in the planning performance of their professional services. Okay, what's the person? There was a ruling called Citizens United that said that company is a person as far as political contributions are concerned. So maybe companies are people. But what about animals? Does it mean it's okay that we don't have to treat animals fairly if we're dealing with sensitive land issue for building or whatever? Can we just go on there and kill all the animals? How about the environment? Can we just ignore the environment because we just have to treat persons with dignity? Gee whiz, there's something, maybe this person needs to be more broadly defined. How about competitors? Are they people or animals or whatever? Corporations, future generations. My goodness, I mean, who would deny that what we do now might have an effect on a future generation? There's some Q&As here. Let's take a quick look. Let's see, why can't you be a senior engineer without a PE? Some of the best engineers I've ever worked with were not PEs. Well, that's an interesting point. And I guess my answer personally on that is yes, I've worked with some very good engineers who are not PEs. The only problem I have was that the implication of being called a senior engineer who is just beginning to learn how to tap out a building and find if there's a hollow spot behind a area of stucco. I'm not sure whether that is the best engineer. I think that guy is a learning engineer. So maybe they don't need to have a PE, but at least they'd better have the qualifications, whether it's from age and the experience and so forth. And yes, some people just can't pass an exam. Some of the best electricians I've ever known were really good mechanics, but they couldn't pass a test to save their soul. Sitting down there and having to answer questions, maybe do a little math, forget it. But you ask them about a 600 amp panel board and they know all about it. So I can't disagree fully with you. I guess my answer is we need to be careful not to be misleading. That's the main thing. And from my point, if you've got a really good engineer, maybe you don't have to, let's just advertise that person for what that person is good for. And let's don't try to pretend that this person is really a senior at something he's just learning how to do. Okay, what do we got here? And here, dignity and respect are becoming rarer commodities. We need to all work on that, especially the art of listening. Boy, I like that. The art of listening is something that I encounter that problem almost every day. And my problem also is I'm hearing impaired. And then so I have to make it a point of trying to listen really hard. But thank you for mentioning that. A lot of people, maybe all of us, I think it's fair to say we all need to keep working on it so that we don't lose the ability to listen. Very important, especially managers listening to people for whom they're responsible. Okay, let's see. Title engineers reserved for PEs in most jurisdictions, and that's true. I mean, we have some situations where a set of plans goes through, and the jurisdiction says you can't do this, and they send it back, and they don't want a response from anybody other than somebody who has PE after their name. So yeah, in certain jurisdictions, PE is really important to have that. So. But then that does that imply that a senior engineer, well, yeah, that's engineer, period. So senior engineer then would certainly have to be a PE in that jurisdiction. So good point. That's why I say that that's why this is called ethics, because it's okay to disagree in ethics. They're pretty complex. Okay, let's see. Mark, what do we got here? The question into a comment I made, not for a beginner. Okay, no problem. Okay. And here's Stephen. PE is an earned title. Engineer may have experience, not title. Yeah, and some will argue, like some jurisdictions, engineer implies professional engineer. And so that's not universally the case, but there are a lot of situations where if you have a title engineer, it's assumed you have the PE after your name. All right, let's see. Now we got there are legal distinctions in different states for certain fields, like in civil, that affect liability, where somebody with the engineer title is assumed to represent themselves as a PE. So yeah, again, one of those dilemmas, and a good example. Thanks for sharing that. And Steve, let's see, should Code of Ethics define person in future versions? I mean, I think it'd be really nice to do that. I think that we need to start thinking about what do we really mean when we say person? Person, place, or thing, human, animal, plant, or tree, or what? I mean, certainly would be something that the various committees who work on these codes could give some thought to. And that's my answer to your comment. Because I have a problem personally with using the word person, when in fact, I feel that the coverage should be a whole more broader in terms of the statement. And thank you for those comments. I appreciate them very much. And again, keep typing in the Q's and A's if you have any others. The future generation as persons, well, you know, up until a couple of years ago, I did not have a great grandson, but I now do, who's 2 years old, a little over 2. 5 years ago, would I have counted him as a person? just the whole idea that in the year 2100, he could be 80 years old if he can survive whatever happens between now and then. So, I like to think that future generations count as people because what we do now might affect them. So that's my opinion, okay? And fortunately, I'm entitled to my opinion, and everyone else here is as well. But these are also can be classified as dilemmas. And so machines and robots. We have this cute little robot vacuum cleaner, and I can't resist talking to that thing like it's my pet dog. I mean, is it a person? Is it a machine that cleans my floor? We also have a cleaning lady who comes in, and I mean, I'll take her over the robot any day in terms of performance and the job she does. On the other hand, this robot really did a great job vacuuming out under the beds. So, wow. Countries, does Puerto Rico count as a person? And I say I specifically listed Puerto Rico because they got really slammed with some nasty hurricanes, and the country itself was not necessarily treated as a person as such at the time. So interesting details on Canon 8. And again, things to think about, food for thought. Tom, here we go. I think person defines another human. The environment or future person should be addressed to the topic of sustainability. Good point. I like that. And sustainability then implies people and all other things that are necessary for a sustainable future for people. And it's probably pretty well agreed, well, maybe not, that people are at the kind of top of this pyramid and everything else below is sustaining the people. Whether it's insects even, which get eaten by chickens, which then get eaten by people. So, gee, sustainability, insects, wow. Thanks, Tom. Good comment. Okay. So let's move on here a little bit. I just want to bring ecofeminism into the picture here. Jane Caputi, the person whose name is on the title page here, teaches in the area of ecofeminism and the ethical implications of it. And I just want to make you sure that just call some of these ideas to your attention so that at least you'll walk away, again, with some additional food for thought. Definition of ecofeminism: the position that there are important connections between how one treats women, people of color, and the underclass on one hand, and how one treats the non-human natural environment on the other. And if you look at page 3 of this particular ecofeminism book, you get some interesting statements about that. Very interesting. An example, water. And there are a lot of cultures, women are responsible for getting the water. And as we pollute the water more and more, the women have to walk further and further to get the water. And that makes them more vulnerable. So, Southern Hemisphere, women and children, their job, get the water. So my goodness, let's don't contaminate the water and make their job more complicated. So the question is the Earth a person? Is the Earth, in fact, a living, breathing, whatever? And one could argue that, hey, it does kind of breathe because trees breathe, so let yourself generalize a little bit. And maybe it's not that complicated to acknowledge that the Earth should be treated like a person. Well, of course, some people we don't treat very nicely. So maybe we need to be careful about that as well. But anyway, the Earth being considered to be an it sort of says, well, we're not worried about the Earth itself. It'll manage, and it probably will. But how well sustainability of humans, how well that works, may have a whole lot to do with how well the planet itself survives. So now here's some little information. Women as world environmental leaders. Almost everybody's heard about Rachel Carlson. At least anybody who's 79 years old like I am has heard about Rachel Carlson, because she is the lady who kind of figured out about DDT, that it's not too nice for a lot of things. Because when you put DDT and kill insects with DDT, then you end up killing birds with DDT, and it goes on and on. And so she wrote Silent Spring, and one of the more famous and better, more repeated phrases is simply that control of nature. And she considered that to be pretty arrogant, because the whole idea that nature exists for the convenience of man almost means man too, and it's almost let out. You know, if you're really fussy about it, women get left out of the equation on this. So in any case, Rachel Carlson is pretty interesting reading. And here's an interesting lady too. She just happened to found the Greenbelt movement, and she also won the 2004 Nobel Peace Prize. So we got to listen to these women, because they are making some very relevant points. And if we don't start treating them like people, and there's some cases where we're not doing that, and it's not a winning proposition by any means. So here's a little more. Rachel Carlson, man is not a part of nature, or man is a part of nature. What am I talking about? And his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. Well, that's pretty profound. And of course, there's groups out there who just are not happy with the idea that pigs and chickens live in little crates like this in order to facilitate feeding people. And again, food for thought. Here we have an Inuit artist with the concept of Mother Nature as nurturing. And anyway, it's just goes on and on and on. And, 2 hours is what we have allocated. I've tried to cover a fair number of topics in a fair number of different areas, just to indicate that ethics is not necessarily a cut and dried situation. It's something that provides a lot of food for thought. There are a lot of dilemmas involved, and we all, at some point or other, will be facing them, at least one way or another. If not, we're probably not doing our job. So in any case, this takes care of the material. It's not lunchtime. Usually I give this in the morning, so it finishes up about noon. But in any case, if anybody's hungry for a snack or dinner or whatever, this is what that lake trout looks like when it's cooked over an open fire in deep, really hot, and it's really good. So here's your 2020 ASCE full code of ethics. Okay, the program's over, but if you order the slides, which is no extra charge, there's some appendix here that gives you the exact wordings of this 2020 ASCE code of ethics. And that kind of answers a previous question as well about what's the deal on all these canons. Okay, so I'm going to click the end show button here. And we are all set now. I'm still screen sharing, and I still can access my participants and my Q's and A's. And let's take a look at the time. I can stop screen sharing, I guess, unless somebody wants me to go back to a particular slide. So let's hold off here for a minute. We've got 5 minutes. for general discussion. Anything anybody wants to talk about? Here's two things in the chat box, but please, if you have something you want to talk about, go to Q&A. The thing in the chat box is probably from the from our host suggesting what the next step is after the session is over. So if anyone has anything further you want to talk about any of the materials we've covered, your input is welcome. I would love to click that Q&A and see what you got to say. All right, Stephen, I appreciate your comment. Okay, and if you check the chat box, I think you're going to get the instructions on how to get to the quiz. Quite sure it's up there, and because that's the next thing that happens here. And of course, it's very convenient to have a copy of the presentation for the quiz because the answers are all on the slides. So keep that in mind about downloading the presentation itself to make it a little easier on the quiz. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the ecofeminism, nature ethics are not exactly on topic for the engineers, but there are certain engineering applications that fit in here. And again, it's food for thought that there are a lot of things we need to think about in what we do. Okay, that's interesting. I'm sure that our host needs to take a look here in the Q's and A's here, because Brian has a question that he went to the link that doesn't take him to the quiz, but it takes him to the advertisement page for the seminar. So, okay, there we go. Okay, yeah. Host was typing. Okay. So I think the answer is coming up on how do I navigate to the quiz. Let's see, Tom, anybody else? I mean, I appreciate the thank yous, don't believe me. Other things I could do at age 79, but I love getting into these kinds of discussions, and I appreciate if anyone appreciates it. It makes it feel like I'm doing something useful, and feeling useful is kind of important when you start getting older. Probably when you were younger too. I guess I always thought that was a good feeling. I'm quite sure the quiz is required in order to pass. I think that's one of the requirements about live. Yeah, PDH is coming up with an answer. But for a live presentation, you have to have quiz questions, and that it's you know, it's easy for somebody to tune in on a meeting and then wander off someplace. So taking a quiz is essentially proof that you really did sit through the session. Okay, let's see what else we got. A phone number. Yes, I can give you. Well, I think probably the host can give you a phone number. Yeah, I'm going to let that happen. And it looks like mostly what we're working on now is navigating to the quiz. So I'm going to close out my part, but that doesn't mean you need to. In fact, I'm going to stay on in case there are any more comments relevant to what I might be able to answer. But I am hoping that the link to the quiz will hopefully appear as a URL very soon. And whether that happens in the chat or the Q&A, I'm not sure. I'm going to open the Q&A now as well, or the chat, and see. Okay, here is under the chat. Okay, the webinar slides are now available for download. Okay, so here's how you download. And click Start Continue Course. The slides are on the next page. The quiz link will be on the same page under the slides. So after the webinar, your certificate of completion will be awarded after the quiz and will also be in your profile page. And the webinar video will also be available in 24 hours. Okay, and the final chat is it's time to end the program. So I guess let's see. Yeah, we're at the 4 o'clock mark. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy your solstice and your whatever holiday you're celebrating. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and end of the year and all that stuff. And we are now ready to stop sharing the screen and to I'll be signing out at this point.